Alright, boys and girls, here we are, the first video of 2014-2015. So let me kind of introduce you to how this all works so you get a good feel for it. Typically when I make a video, I'll have this little introductory time here where I'll talk to you about the important aspects of the chapter and things like that. And then of course I have a PowerPoint presentation that I can go right into, and I can write all over it and stuff like that, and make sure that I emphasize the things most important for you to remember. I mean, there's a lot of information in here, but you know I will tell you the things to really zero in on and remember that are most important. Including probably I'll decide to put a little quiz in the middle of this to make sure that you watched. Please watch the videos. Alright, another thing that I'll always do is I'll tell you what page in the book we're at, because I think the best way for you to approach this is to watch these videos with your textbook on a desk, with your computer, and maybe some ability to take notes. I gave you that little handout that tells you about the flipped classroom. You should be asking yourself questions as I go through this thing. You know, what are the key points? When you are confused or you have a question about the information that I'm covering, you know, jot it down so you can ask me. The one bad thing about doing videos is we don't have one-on-one interaction at the time you watch the video. So you need to write down your questions so that you remember to ask me the next day. That way I can clear up any misconceptions that you might have regarding the information. So we're starting chapter 3. And that begins on page 58 in your textbook. It's Friday afternoon. You're out having fun getting ready for the big football game tonight. And here I am sitting in my house making videos for you. That's because I give and I give and I give. Here goes. Okay, boys and girls, let's get started here. This is the first picture that's in chapter 3 with the little story about Haiti. And of course, as we always do, we'll read that first story in class. Remember to take a look at the yellow box on page 58. It gives you kind of a list of the things that are most important for you to remember that happens in this chapter. I'll cover the first bullet in this video, the basic components of an ecosystem. But first, let's take a look at this picture. This is a stark contrast diagram or a picture of deforestation. And you can see that the country line is here. It's kind of obvious that you can see here where the line ended. This country decided to cut down all its trees, and of course that's all ecosystem. Very important ecosystem. The reason it's important is because it's tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest has high biodiversity, which means there's lots of different species there. This country, they're not cutting down all of their trees. They're trying to preserve the habitat for all of the creatures, plant and animal, that live in the ecosystem. So we'll read that story later. Let's go ahead and get into this. As usual, knowing the definitions of the terms that we use in a chapter are vital for you, because in science, that's the language that we talk about. So let's first talk about what an ecosystem is. Ecosystem is all of the living and non-living factors in an area. And by living, we mean biotic. That term biotic means living things. And abiotic, A in front of anything means not. So abiotic factors that are in the ecosystem count as well, the non-living things. For instance, well, you think about it. Can you think of something that's abiotic in the ecosystem? The soil, the air that the creatures are breathing, the water, the rocks. You know, these are all non-living things, but they're part of the ecosystem too. So it's both the biotic and the abiotic factors in an area. That's what an ecosystem is. Now, it's not always very easy to tell where one ecosystem starts and another ecosystem ends. Imagine, for instance, an open field, and then at the end of that field is a forest. Well, you can sort of see the big trees and know that, one ecosystem's starting and one's beginning. But what if the forest doesn't immediately start? What if it's just a little bit more trees and then a little bit more trees? So there's no real line of when an ecosystem starts and ends. Now, you can certainly tell an ecosystem boundary when we go from water to land. And that's the example that's in this diagram here. You can see here's the land ecosystem, here's the aquatic ecosystem, and there are areas where they intersect, right? This is called a tidal zone. At low tide, it's land. At high tide, it's underwater. This is known as, on this diagram, it's showing you a transition zone, but it's known as an ecotone. There's a term for you. You've probably never heard it or used it before, so you better write it down and memorize it. You better know what an ecotone is. And that is the boundary between two ecosystems. And this diagram is showing you something else. The ecotone, or the transition zone, has a higher biodiversity than either one of the separate ecosystems. And the reason for that is organisms that can survive in each are found in the transition zone in the middle. So you can see this line here is showing you the number of species. It's low and then it goes up. And here in the transition zone at the height, we're seeing lots of different species because both land creatures and water creatures, land plants and water plants, can survive in the transition zone. And then as we get more into the water, only the aquatic species can survive, so the number of species goes down again. Notice I'm saying the number of species, not the number of different organisms. So ecotone, an important term for you. This picture here is in your book, and it's just kind of showing you that ecosystems can be any size that you decide to analyze. We can talk about the riverbank ecosystem. We can talk about the St. Johns River as an ecosystem. We can talk about Clay County as an ecosystem. Or we can talk about the hole that's in a tree as an ecosystem. Because all of the living and non-living things that are inside this hole, this is also an ecosystem. Tiny little unicellular organisms like Paramecium, like Euglena. We have insects that live, maybe in their early stages, maybe the larval stage or the pupal stage. And then, of course, we got the tree itself. That is a living organism. You've got the water that's inside this knothole. That's an abiotic factor. So you get the idea. You can study this little knothole in a tree as an ecosystem, or you can study something as big as Yellowstone National Park, or even larger than that, all of the other areas surrounding Yellowstone National Park as one very large ecosystem. Let's talk about energy and how energy flows through the ecosystem. Key, most important point. All of the energy on planet Earth is brought to you by photosynthesis. You're going to see the equation for photosynthesis in a minute, and you must memorize it. You've got to know the equation for photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, glucose is made, and glucose is the energy compound, the energy-containing compound for all life on Earth. Nothing could survive without photosynthesis, without taking the energy from the sun and turning it into a chemical that's useful to us. We do that in the process known as photosynthesis. The organisms that do photosynthesis are called autotrophs. Now let's break that word down for a minute. Anytime you see the word troph, you'll see it on the next slide. We talk about trophic levels. Anytime you see troph, that word means energy. Auto in front of anything, you've already learned in English class, means self. So autotrophs are self-energizing. They make their own glucose. Autotrophs are also known as producers because they're producing the energy for the rest of the ecosystem. Now, typically when you think of photosynthesis, you think of plants, but it's not just plants. There are many bacteria that are photosynthetic. There are many algae that are photosynthetic. All of these organisms together provide the energy for all of the rest of us. The entire rest of the ecosystem is provided energy through the process of photosynthesis in the ecosystem. And that's done by autotrophs. Here is that photosynthesis formula. You've got to memorize it. Water plus carbon dioxide yields glucose plus oxygen. And I think I've already told you before, you've got to know the glucose formula as well. So you need to understand how this works. In a plant, remember, here we go. Here's plants, algae, some bacteria. They all do photosynthesis. But let's just focus in on the plant because by far the most photosynthesis on land happens by way of trees. The leaf is a perfectly designed energy factory. It collects solar energy and it's perfectly made for that. It's flat, so the sun's rays can hit it dead on. And of course, leaves have plant cells, and plant cells have those little energy parts that are called chloroplasts. The chloroplasts absorb the sun's rays and turn that wavelength energy into chemical energy in the form of a glucose molecule. Carbon dioxide is required, water is required, and don't forget that the sun is required. Photosynthesis doesn't happen in the dark. It's the conversion of the sun's energy into chemical energy. I mean, that is what photosynthesis is. Leaves are fantastic. Now you'll notice as we get further into the fall and winter, the thing about leaves is they contain this green pigment called chlorophyll, and that chlorophyll attracts the sun's rays. But that pigment gets worn out. The chemicals break down over the course of the year. So in the fall and winter, the chlorophyll begins to break down, and that's when we see the leaves turn color, turn to a yellow and turn to an orange. That's the chlorophyll breaking down into its subcomponents. Eventually the leaf falls, and now that tree is doing a lot less photosynthesis. In fact, it's probably doing very little photosynthesis. Nothing really is green on it. But that's okay. It did so much photosynthesis all during the spring and summer, it has all the glucose it needs stored. So it will get through the winter. And then when the spring comes, we have new leaves form and photosynthesis begins all over again. Let's not forget, we have inputs and we have outputs. It's not just the glucose, but also oxygen is released. And that's key to help our environment, because after all, the reason we breathe is so we can get the oxygen that's in the air. I wonder if you know what percent of the air is oxygen. We'll cover that in another chapter. All right. So that's how energy is created. Sun's rays turn into the chemical energy of a glucose molecule. Here's how the energy is consumed or used up. And that process is called cellular respiration. I already mentioned it to you from chapter 2. Every living thing does cellular respiration. Even the autotrophs, right? They're making glucose, but they're also using it because every cell in their organism, just like every cell in your body, needs glucose in order to get its energy. That chemical process is called cellular respiration. The organisms that do cellular respiration are called consumers. So that's the opposite of producer. All right, we are consumers. We don't produce anything. We consume the energy. And there's also a group of organisms that are important in our ecosystem. Not only are they consumers that do cellular respiration, but also they break down chemicals into usable components in the soil or other usable chemicals that living things can use. That way, all of the chemicals in the ecosystem are cycling. If they're not in an organism, then when the organism dies, the decomposers are breaking down those chemicals, returning them to the system so that new chemicals can be made fresh again. Here's your diagram for respiration. Little mousey sitting on the ground, eating his little grass. He's eating a producer, of course he is. He needs his glucose. He can't make it himself. And here is the formula you must memorize that has to do with cellular respiration. Now here in the book, they decided to just move the arrow. You might want to think of it in a reverse mode and keep the arrow moving this way. You might want to think of it as glucose plus oxygen yielding carbon dioxide plus water. H2O, and it gives us carbon dioxide and water. So either way you think of it, if you want to memorize it the same way both ways and just move the arrow, either way it doesn't matter. The important thing for you to recognize is this consumer is taking glucose out of the grass in the presence of oxygen. It's a breathing organism, and it is releasing, it's getting its energy, and then it's releasing carbon dioxide and water. Nice picture here. I know this may be a review for you, but I'm telling you, this is the essence of life on planet Earth. Photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, when we talk about these energy levels, trophic levels, remember troph in any word means energy, we have different levels. It's called a food chain. I'll show you a picture of a food chain in a minute. And we have autotrophs, organisms that make their own energy. Hetero means different or other, and so heterotrophs means they get their energy from some different organism. And that's how consumers operate. They've got to eat something in order to get their glucose. Primary consumers are the organisms that eat the plants. They eat autotrophs. Primary consumers eat autotrophs. So if that autotroph is a plant, and usually it is, when we show a food chain, we usually show some group of animals in an ecosystem on land. It's a herbivore. Herb, plant. Vor, eat. So they eat plants. Primary consumers are also known as herbivores. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. That's why they're secondary. These secondary consumers can certainly eat plants if they want to, but they also will eat meat. They will eat the animals that are primary consumers. A good example of primary consumer is a cow. Cows eat grass. The autotroph, the producer, is the grass. The primary consumer is the cow. Guess who's the secondary consumer? Us. Because we slaughtered a cow for beef, that makes us an omnivore. Omnivores will eat both plants and animals. Further up the food chain are the tertiary consumers. These are animals that eat other animals that eat the plants. Tertiary to secondary, secondary to primary. And since they eat meat only, they're called carnivores. Now don't be fooled, just because you eat a lot of meat doesn't make you a carnivore. Our species of humans are omnivores because we have the digestive capability to eat both plants and animals. So we're omni. Carnivores are animals that eat only other animals. When I think of tertiary consumer, I think of birds of prey. I think of animals on the top of the food chain. Decomposers, of course, are vital. In fact, if I ever ask you to draw an ecosystem or a food chain, don't ever forget the decomposers. Because without them, this thing cannot cycle back. It cannot be a closed loop energy system without the decomposers breaking down the chemicals that are left behind. And then we have detritivores. You need to know all these definitions of these organisms. Detritivores feed on dead tissue. Decomposers break down chemicals into smaller chemicals. Detritivores are organisms that feed off of meat, off of animals, like bacteria. We have a lot of bacteria in our system that are detritivores. They break down dead material. And then we have scavengers. Scavengers eat dead organisms. You know, scavengers like a vulture. You know, they come down and they will pick and eat at roadkill on the side of the road. They're scavengers. They only eat things that are already dead. So those are the different energy levels that we find in an ecosystem. Here's a nice picture of it. And probably the most important concept I want you to get out of this video today is the idea of how the energy flows and how much of it flows. Because there's a rule when we talk about food chains. It's called the 90-10 rule. And in the 90-10 rule, 90% of the energy is lost as you go from one trophic level to the next. Only 10% of the available energy ends up in the next organism. So we have the producers, and they're doing their thing, algae in this case. The algae does all of its photosynthesis, and let's say there's 10 grams of 10 calories. Let's say there's 10 kilocalories in this algae, because after all, calorie is an energy measurement, right? Remember that from chapter 2. So if there's 10 calories available from the algae, when the zooplankton eat them, only 1 calorie is available to the zooplankton, and 9 calories is lost as heat. Remember the second law of thermodynamics? It's in play here. 9 calories lost. And then we go up to the fish that eats the zooplankton. 90-10 rule. Only 10% of the energy is available to the fish. So now we have 0.1 calorie available to the fish. Because the other 0.9 got lost as heat because of the second law of thermodynamics. And then we have this tertiary consumer, a bird of prey, and they're only getting 0.01 calories of energy. So these guys get very little energy out of one organism. So they have to eat all the time to get the kind of energy that they need. And you'll notice something that we have in our lives. We don't ever eat birds of prey. You never go to a restaurant and have some osprey for dinner. And we don't eat these things because there's no energy in it for us. These guys are already tertiary. They're at the top of the food chain and they're not getting much energy anyway. So it doesn't behoove us to eat too high up the food chain. Plain and simple. In fact, your best bet is to always be around here. Always be a primary consumer where you're eating salads and vegetables and stuff, or maybe you're a secondary consumer when you're eating fish or beef or pork or something like that. But you don't want to be a tertiary consumer because of what little energy you're getting out of that meal. There are tertiary things we eat. We eat gator tail, right? You're not getting much calorie. You're not getting much energy out of that feed because you're all the way up here in the tertiary area. You want to try to stay in the primary and in the secondary consumer area for energy. This is a land one, terrestrial. It's showing you the same idea. Zebra eats the grass. lion eats the zebra. And one other thing I want to point out here, you've got to learn this. When I ask you to draw an ecosystem, or I ask you to draw a food chain, that arrow always points in the direction of the movement of the energy. Yes, the lion eats the zebra, so you might think the arrow should go down. No. Whenever you see a food chain or a food web, which is coming up next, that arrow is pointing in the direction of the energy flow. Never forget that. Here is a food web. You know, food webs are a little bit of a better depiction of what's happening in an ecosystem because it shows multiple food opportunities. You know, for instance, the gazelle is a food source. The gazelle here is a food source for both the cheetah and for the lion. But notice where the arrow is flowing. The gazelle is the thing with the energy, so the energy is flowing from the gazelle to the lion. The energy is flowing from the gazelle to the cheetah. Likewise, the grass is the producer and it's got a lot of energy, and so the rabbit eats the grass. The energy is going from the grass up to the rabbit. Make sure you learn about the movement of these arrows. Okay, so I think I'm going to end this one here. It's been about 15 minutes, I think, and I'm going to start a new video. I'll probably do another one right now, but I wanted to break these up for you. Please remember the 90-10 rule. I'll probably ask you something about that in the form of a quiz. All right, talk to you later, guys. Hope you enjoyed a football game. Later.